an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Red Sister, chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. Sorry, not 14. I'm sorry. I should have checked all this before I started, but here we are. In these chapters, there is a terrible scene with a horse getting beaten to death, which I pretty much tried to skim because I could not take it. And also we find out that the moon isn't a moon, and that's pretty cool. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Martin for commissioning this episode. I'm always excited when I see Red Sister on the schedule because it's spaced out so much that I'm always just like, yay, because I really want to get further into this and find out where we're going with all of it. Martin's here in the chat. Hi, Martin. So, okay, the start of chapter 9 is basically everybody rushing to get to class because the end of chapter 8 was all of them realizing that they were going to be late to Mistress Spirit's class, who turns out to be Sister Wheel, right? She is the worst. She's the worst. There's probably worse, but she's pretty terrible. And it's an interesting thing that later on it's talked about in terms that it's not just that she is so mean-spirited and seemingly like lacking in empathy or generosity of spirit, but Nona feels like she recognizes something in that woman that exists also in herself. And because of that, she mistrusts her. And I know it's a cliche to be like, oh, well, we only dislike people who have a lot of the same flaws as we do. And we hate people that are reflections of ourselves more than the ordinary person who's doing terrible things. And I get that that could feel a little bit trite and tidy, but actually it's more like that's just how human nature tends to work, right? Like, it feels trite because it's true. It's a cliche because it tends to be true. And we have a really hard time forgiving ourselves for things when we are self-aware enough to know what our flaws even are. That I specify it in this way because when there is somebody who is able to look at their own shortcomings and flaws in a measured enough way with enough honesty, that often means that they are like taking responsibility for that, right? And giving themselves kind of a hard time for the mistakes that they've made and the general fuck-ups or bad patterns that they are getting into. The times when people are not aware or don't have that sort of desire even for introspection, they are also not going to be really taking responsibility for the things that they have done wrong or for their own flaws, because they will still be either blaming other people or simply blame circumstance as a whole. And I want to be clear, I believe that circumstance and luck has a lot more to do with our lives than we like to think. We always like to think that we are in control of things, and that if somebody's doing badly, it's because of bad choices that that person has made. And that is garbage and 100% not true. And anybody who has lived for any length of time and has any sort of like perspective or empathy would know that. But there are people out there who solely blame circumstance and other people and don't seem to feel that if there is a pattern happening in their lives, they are the consistent common denominator. And so if there is something that continues to happen over and over to them, maybe this is something that they are partially responsible for. So we know that Nona is, if nothing else, introspective. She is somebody that has a very acute sense of the hand that she has been dealt versus the hand that everyone else has been dealt. And when I say that, it sounds like she's constantly comparing herself and making it seem like she's in such a worse circumstance than anybody. But I don't mean that. And if you read this, you know that's not what I mean. It's just interesting that she is as young as she is. And she's already realizing, like, yeah, I have a problem with this teacher because part of the thing that I think is wrong with her, I also think is wrong with me. And I could really understand being young and seeing somebody who's that much older and in a position of authority, like seemingly displaying traits that you are hoping to grow out of eventually. And that being really alarming to be like, oh, that person is grown and still is guilty of or struggling with the things that I am. And what if this just is how it is and doesn't go away? Which is a fucking depressing thought. And I think all of us, as we get older, come to these realizations of being like, I really, when I was younger, assumed that this shit would just kind of work itself out, or that growing up it would become easier, or that I would find other people that I could relate to more. And now I'm starting to be like, shit, that's not necessarily how it goes. But I just really am interested to see if her perspective on this woman changes at all. I don't know how long she's going to be in this school. I don't have any sense in, like, regarding the structure of this novel, whether or not it's going to be a story about a girl continuing on with her education and having adventures within the school, the way that, like, a Harry Potter book, for lack of a better comparison, forgive me, works. Or if it's going to be, this is a pit stop, and eventually she is going to have to bounce up out of here too. And, you know, this will be a story about her life never really belonging anywhere, or not belonging anywhere right away, or what. I am extremely interested to see which direction this goes in. So let's see, they go, the class that they're going to, it's really fun to hear about the ways in which all of the classrooms differ. So later on, they go to their class of, with the poisoner, who turns out to be Sister Apple, which is just great. But at this point, they're doing, let's see, the dim light yielded only an impression of great columns and a polished floor with some brighter space beyond. They were in a grand foyer that itself was bigger than all but the richest houses in Verity. So, like, this is, like, essentially a cathedral, right? Like, later on, their other class is in a cave. It's like, you know, akin to the dungeons where they're learning potions. I keep making Harry Potter references. I'm sorry. But nevertheless. And Sister Wheels says something as they come rushing in, late to class, but never late to dinner. Which Nona is just like, I've literally been to one dinner here. What are you talking about? Which I do like that. There is a real vibe from Sister Wheel of her being like the boomer yelling at the millennials, even though she hasn't got any idea what the fuck she's talking about. Like, yelling at her about her avocado toast when Nona's literally like, I had ramen for 3 meals today. I don't know what you mean about avocado toast. But yeah, so this class is clearly like meant to be like a big deal. And I feel like Wheel gets a bit of a ego boost from being the one to teach this. It's so funny. Clara is like, she takes out her quill and it says, The latter gave the impression that the bird from which it was taken had died of some wasting disease, falling from its perch into a dirty puddle before being run over by several carts and finally thoroughly chewed by a hungry cat. Which, damn! And then Arabella's quill caught the light, becoming something ethereal, a perfect swan's feather, pristine and glistening. The worst. So there is a weird moment here where Sister Wheel is really irritated at the fact that Nona doesn't have her quill and stuff out. And as she's saying this, I was thinking to myself, does Nona even know how to read and write? Like, I wasn't sure about it, and I thought not, but apparently it did not even enter Sister Wheel's head that this could be a potential issue. And she's like really getting pushy, Sister Wheel is. Nona felt a familiar anger starting to boil deep down where her thinking never ventured. I love that. Even if she had been given such things as a quill and parchment, she had never held either in her life and could no more make the required marks with one upon the other than she could fly. Well, Sister Wheel, now looming above Nona, her pale and watery eyes meeting Nona's stare. Nona stood up sharply. Novice Nona's entry to the convent was non-standard. Abbess Glass had entered without being noticed, and now settled a hand on Nona's shoulder, returning her to her seat. This precluded the usual correspondence regarding the supplies an entrant is expected to bring with them, Mistress Spirit. The abbess laid a grey-plumed quill and a fat scroll of parchment on the desk. Nona will, however, be a listening pupil, rather than a writing one, until such time as Sister Kettle pronounces her sufficiently advanced in her extracurricular activities. She will, and here she gets cut off by Sister Wheel, whose face gets red, and she says, I know exactly what kinds of extracurricular activity Sister Kettle gets up to, and with whom, and Abbess Glass cuts off Sister Wheel, and says, Sister Kettle will improve Nona's reading and writing to the standard required in red class. The abbess fixed Sister Wheel with a stare. The matter is now closed. So, what the fuck was that about Sister Kettle? What is that about? Because it sounds like she's being like, oh, I know she fucks tons of dudes. But is that what she's saying? Because are there lots of dudes around to screw? Or is she like trying to say, like, because it sounds sexual, right? It does not sound like she's like, oh, I know all about her and her secret gambling ring that she runs, or I know all about her and how she cooks meth in the basement. Like, there is a vibe and a tone to this that definitely is like, that slut. And it could be that Sister Kettle is gay or bi or, whatever, and is hooking up with other women. Or it could be a complete invention that she just decided this thing, because she doesn't seem like somebody who's above simply making a judgment call about a person and sticking with that no matter what it is that she gets faced with in reality. So I am extremely curious about hearing more about this, because Sister Kettle we meet again later when Nona has her exam, or not exam, her practice, her tutoring. And I had kind of expected there to be like a hint in that conversation that told us, like, or not even told us, but hinted in a direction, or at least like planted the kernel of an idea. And it doesn't seem like there was, unless I missed it. The only thing I could think otherwise is that I know what she gets up to, and she's talking about like poisoning students, because Kettle is the one that like winds up poisoning Nona a little bit later. But yeah, I have no idea. So this like winds up being a bit of a confrontation moment, and the abbess is all too aware that Sister Wheel is she is a vengeful person. She is a vindictive bitch. And really wants to beat students for like any particular infraction. And the way to get rid of her is to send her to find a wire cane to beat Nona with, because Nona talks back to the abbess here. So she says, let's see, Sister Wheel teaches the important details of our veneration of the ancestor, the mechanics of the thing, if you like, the hows and the whens. She does it well, and we thank her for it. It falls to me, though, to remind us all of the whys. Nona, for example, was a follower of the Hope before she came to us, and whilst the Hope is a sanctioned heresy that falls within the framework of the ancestor, Yes, Nona? So Nona stands up and says, my mother went to the Hope Church in White Lake, but I never said the words. One star is white and the other's red. Why should I kneel to it? That's what her father had said. In my village, they pray to the gods who are many and who have no names. Abbess Glass pursed her lips. Such practices are unusual in verity, Nona. In the wild lands to the east and across the border into Shithrol, I hope I'm saying that right, there are remnants of many faiths, and the emperor is tolerant of them at a distance. But the ancestor, and Nona interrupts again and starts talking about her father hunting in the tunnels beneath the ice. And this is the first that we as readers have heard of this. And apparently these tunnels are carved by rivers that still run beneath the ice where it's deep enough that it hasn't just frozen over. Her father and his clan had hunted beasts from every tale she'd ever heard. The best of his stories told of the missing, those who were not men and who lived on Abath before the 4 tribes descended from the stars. No man had ever set eyes upon the missing, but their servants remained, a remnant now, haunting the dark places beneath the ice where sites holy to the missing lay exposed once more. Such ruins could be found here and there, where the tunnels ventured across the cities that the missing had carved deep into the very rock itself. My father said that the ancestor might watch over us in the corridor, but in the dark places of this world, it's the gods that the missing left behind who matter. And apparently, this is really not some shit that you should be saying out loud. She's basically like, my dad said that Jesus was fine and dandy when things were great, but when shit goes bad, you definitely need to get back to those pagan gods, though. And the abbess is obviously trying to hold it together. She's not thrilled, but Sister Wheel is literally going to combust over in the corner. She's about to pop. So the abbess starts to try and engage with this in a reasoned way. And it's just like, yeah, the worship of idols is forbidden, but there are a lot of things that like we don't know about, and there's a lot of history under the ice and all of that, and I acknowledge that. Nevertheless, that's heresy. And Abbess Glass is like, we connect with what is holy in the human spirit, what is holy in us. And Nona just blurts out, you're not holy. You watched Saida die. You watched her strangle and choke. And at this point, that's it. Like, I was really surprised that this goes as well for her as it does. But I would not have even been that mad at the abbess if she had, like, gone ham a little bit. So this is when she tells Sister Wheel to go and get a wire cane. And Sister Wheel is, like, delighted, fucking glowing with excitement as she leaves the room. And she says, I'm not holy? What is holy, Nona? Anyone? Nona would have answered, but she found that she didn't know. I believe in the ancestor, in the spirit of the ancestor. Believe? Like Sister Wheel believes? Nona could not keep the venom from her words. When she looked at Wheel, it seemed that something had been left out in the making of the woman. Nona felt the same way about herself most of the time, as if some part had been omitted in her construction, so wholly absent that she couldn't even say what it was, only that a void lay where it should be. I hate Sister Wheel. It's harder to forgive someone else your own sins than those uniquely theirs. Much harder. That is a good line. And Nona is basically like, y'all are talking about being holy and doing good. But you guys are warm and fed and safe. And there are people out there dying of starvation, freezing to death, hanging for murder that they did not commit. And what the fuck am I supposed to give a shit about holiness for if we are not doing jack all about those people out there? To which the abbess is like, no, you're right. If we spent our whole lives here, we would have little to offer the world, and know little enough of the world to have context for our prayer. Without knowing the chaos and confusion that washes all around this plateau, our rock of faith, we could not appreciate the serenity that we seek. I wasn't always a nun. I had a son, and I breathed for him. When we buried him, my sorrow consumed me. Was my grief holy? Was it unique? All our hurts and follies are repeated time and again. Generation after generation live the same mistakes. But we're not like the fire or the river or the wind. We're not a single tune, its variations played out forever, a game of numbers until the world dies. There's a story written in us. Your parents, your father and his ice tunnels, your mother and her church of hope, both of them, whether they loved you or left you, are in you bone deep, remembered in your blood. The Hunska has risen to the surface in you, the quickness of some relative dead these past 10,000 years. You think your mother and father are less present? There's a story written in us, added to with each conception. It remembers and it changes us. We move to something from something. Life, death. We spend all our years on the short journey across this gap. But look, the gap is narrow if you cross it, but follow it, and it's long. As long as you like. You and I journey across the gap, but as people, we follow it. The ancestor stands at both ends. The ancestor watches us from before the flight, before the ship hearts first beat their rhythm. That is the ancestor of singular form, the origin, the alpha. Along our journey, we have become many and varied. The ancestor watches us from the start and from the end, from beyond the death of stars in the cold dark of beyond. That is the ancestor of singular mind, the destination, the omega. The ancestor is meaning in chaos, memory in time, and that is holy. So, I'm not totally sure I'm following completely. One of the main moments, and this happened more in these chapters than it has in the past. There are a lot of sentences dropped without context by characters. And some of them, for example, the focus moon, do get explained a little bit later on. And others, I am unsure because of how long it is between these episodes, whether it's been mentioned and I have forgotten it, or if it's something that I have not been yet told and I am going to be told about. So, you know, if anybody wants to enlighten me on which this is, if this is something that I have not yet learned about, or if it's something that I should remember and don't, the ancestor watches us from before the flight, before the ship hearts first beat their rhythm. What is that? Ship hearts. We don't know about that. Am I wrong? Because I feel like I would remember that. I don't know what that means. And it's weird because like there are a lot of descriptors of this universe that feel like we're talking about people with very little technology. But there's like the ship hearts, there's something about that makes me wonder if that isn't a little bit more advanced. And then the fact that they like literally launched a moon into orbit around the planet, maybe their tech is like disappearing because they don't have a lot of resources anymore versus the fact that they did not have it in the first place. But anyway, the abbess brings Nona out of the classroom and is like, look, Sister Wheel's been trying to find this wire cane. She's going to be coming back with it. So we're going to get you out of here and you need to go to the sinkhole and contemplate for an hour instead of having dinner. That's going to be your punishment. To which Nona is like, all right, that's fair. I've eaten so much food the past couple days. I can stand to miss a single meal. It's fine. And they are in the middle of talking about this when they get interrupted. So these people show up and nobody saw them coming. A judge of the high circuit and 9 men-at-arms. And the abbess is just like, how could they have come here without being seen first? We didn't have any like alert that they were heading our way. Fetch my crozier, Nona, will you? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing crozier right. So she goes and does this. And it says here that she's surprised at its weight. And I am unpleasantly reminded of what happens with I called it a horse in the intro, but I believe it's like a donkey or a mule or something. What happens later. And the fact that this like gets dropped here as a sort of a foreshadowing. They saw the visitors making their way through the pillars, is ill at ease amongst the forest of stone. The stone from which those pillars are made can't be found anywhere in the corridor. It's all beneath the ice now, lost to us. Which is pretty wild, actually, the idea that there's an entire material that like they can't even access anymore. I find that to be really sort of, I don't know, it's symbolic, of course, but also just like in a very practical way, kind of spooky, you know? So these people like present themselves in front of the abbess's steps, and this old man gets down off of his horse, and he is apparently a judge. A thick circlet of twisted gold strands held a white mane from his patrician's face. He regarded the abbess from beneath neatly trimmed eyebrows, channeling a slight air of distaste down either side of a prominent and angular nose. So there's this younger man who comes forward, and he's got this book, and he announces Judge Ervone Galamis, and he is apparently here to grip up Nona. Now, the abbess is not impressed or intimidated at all, and has no intention of handing Nona over to this guy. She does not make it even clear that Nona, who is standing right beside her, is the one that this guy is looking for. But the dude seems to zero in on her in such a way. And he reads to her some like really ancient sub-law that basically allows for Nona to be taken by him despite the fact that she didn't get a trial. A law that's so old that it was like written into law before the convent even existed. And then there is another one, which would one not require someone to have been murdered in order to hang another person for murder? And he reads another one. In cases of attempted murder, the perpetrator may hang for murder if the original conviction were based on the reasonable belief that the victim would die. So, yeah, he keeps on doing all of these different things. And she starts to realize that Raymel Taxis, the one that she has killed, that Lord Taxis is the person who has sent this judge out, his father. And Raymel is the one that was about to kill Saida. Raymel was the piece of abusive garbage. And the big black book of laws hit the ground with a resounding thump. That's her, isn't it? The young assistant advanced towards the steps, fingers pointing at Nona. That's the little bitch who did it. Lano? The judge shook his head, more in resignation than anger. I told you should not have come. Nona stared at him, seeing the man for the first time and finding something familiar in the narrow cast of his features, perhaps the pale fury in the eyes or the slant of his lips. He would have killed Saida. The anger of that moment in the Kaltess returned to Nona in an instant, as if it had never left. Lanotaxis moved faster than anyone Nona had ever seen. A blur of dark robes twisting past Sister Flint even as she reached for him with reflexes to shame a cave viper. Nona barely had time to throw up her hands in front of the fingers reaching to seize her by the throat. A moment later, Lana was being hauled backward, a scream of anger choked off by Sister Flint's slim arm fastened around his neck. So, this moment is very, very alarming. So first of all, this dude was disguised. Second of all, he is apparently what's-his-face's brother. Third of all, or is he his father? I think it's his brother, though, right? Yeah, here it is. Lanotaxis, does your father know you're here, young man? Yeah. Your disguise and turn of speed were both admirable. It seems that both of Thorantoxis' sons have yet to learn that beating little girls is not a pastime that can be pursued entirely without consequence. I love that line so much. So basically, Lano keeps doing the, like, once my father hears about this, we have the money to buy this whole fucking place out from under, like the whole bullshit, you know. And he is talking about how he holds up his hands and his hands are bleeding. And I, as the reader, am like, how the fuck did she get his hands to bleed? Did she like break his fingers and like bone came through? Like, what the fuck did she even do? And the abbess steps up to Nona and says, you have a knife? And Nona just nods. And I'm waiting for her to show the knife, but she doesn't do it. And Abbess Glass is like, well, I understand that, but you need to put it back at the blade stores. And Nona says, yes, Abbess, I will. Are you sure none of that blood is yours? The Abbess asked. Nona flexed her hands, the fingers already sticking to each other. I'm sure. Run along then, put that knife back, and we won't speak of it again. It's my duty and the duty of all your sisters here to protect you. You don't need a blade. Yes, Abbess. Nona got quickly to her feet. I will. She wanted to thank the abbess, but nothing she thought to say sounded right, and whatever had happened, Abbess Glass had still watched Saida hang. Nona ran off, the corridor wind trying to steer her. She would put the knife into Blade Hall's stores right away, but first she would run to the dormitories and retrieve it from her bed. I was reading this sitting next to Owen, and I got to that line and I just went, what? And Owen was playing a video game and he stopped and like took his headphones off and was like, what? And I was like, she didn't even have the knife that she just attacked somebody with. And Owen just stared at me and was like, babe. And I'm like, no, never mind. I'm sorry. Because I just didn't have time to like give him the full context. But I could not figure it out. So this is clearly the knife that like she found embedded in her headboard, right? Like that but I don't understand because like, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So chapter 10, she is like overhearing a bunch of different conversations, and, you know, trying to get to the bathhouse, but like listening in on some different chit chats here and there. You weren't even here back then to see it, girl. Abbess Shard hadn't the guts to keep him out. He'd have the novices over to Hart Hall for special testing, and not just the older ones. Ooh, don't care for this at all. And, you know, she keeps hearing little things like this, but it's unclear exactly how much Nona understands about the conversations. However, I assume Nona understands a bit, because she has seen some shit, and she has been out there. So she probably has, unfortunately, a pretty good idea of how bad things can get. So everybody is talking to her, like Clara especially is just like, what the fuck happened with the judge? They're looking for you. What even did you do? And this is when Nona tells both Ruli and Clara that she lied to them about the way shit went down. So I had said that the story she told sounded pretty wild and maybe was true, but I didn't think it was. It was just hard to know. And it turns out, honestly, in a lot of ways, like the broad strokes of the story are kind of true, because the weirdness of all of these people winding up dead did still happen. And that's the part that one would think, if she were going to lie, that would be what you'd think she made up. But it turns out that it's a part that's more shameful that she made up, which is the fact that her mother was dead. She didn't want them to know, basically, that her mother agreed that she should be given away. Martin says, do you think this story is true or a lie too? Yeah, I was thinking about it, Martin, and I'm like, I can't decide if this is true or not. Like, it sounds more true than the other, but it's also so strange. But I can't tell sometimes whether or not Nona is telling a straight up lie, or if Nona is telling them what she thinks happened and doesn't actually have a great memory of it either. In other words, is she just continuing to share something that she really genuinely believes, but isn't actually true? Or is she protecting herself somehow? Because I want to think that this knife that like just shows up and that appears in her hand and then is like somehow gone again. And I say appears in her hand in so much as like that's the easiest way to put it, even though nobody sees the knife. And when we're reading it from her perspective, it's not like she suddenly felt a knife in her hands and cut him. We just see the scene as her hands flying up to protect herself, and he pulls his hands back and suddenly he's bleeding. But she does not have the knife on her, apparently. So we like that moment, one would expect, if she doesn't know what's happening, for her to express that fact, right? For her to say something to Abbess Glass like, hey, I definitely did not cut that guy. I don't know how that happened. But she doesn't. She covers for herself, which leads me to believe that something like this happened. But I'm not sure that this is it. I can't help but wonder if she was a little bit more of an active participant, and simply because she doesn't understand how that could have happened, she has chosen some way to explain it that isn't really true, but in her mind is as true as it's possible to be, and still explain how this fucking could have happened. Does that make sense? Because there's all kinds of stuff where you just are like, I have had sort of inexplicable moments in my life, not to this degree, clearly, but things that I'm just like, so what I assume is that this, and this happened. And so I'll continue to tell the story as if this, and this happened, even though I don't really have proof that that's what went down. It's just that I have to assume because there's no other reasonable explanation. So, all right. I clicked iMovie. Close iMovie, please. Thank you. Okay. So she talks about the juggler, and she talks about how he leaves and her mother was really, really angry, throwing things, cursing, and yada, yada, yada. She said it was my fault, all of my fault, that I'd driven Amando away and that she hated me. And of course, these two girls think that what she means is that Amando was like taking up with Nona or molested her or something, and that her mother blamed her, which is an unfortunately completely realistic thing. Women date shitty garbage men, and those men abuse their daughters, and then the women will blame the daughters. This happens so frequently that it's a total cliche. So that's what you assume is happening here, like her friends do for sure. And she is thinking to herself that she's going to go and track Amando down and try and convince him to come back, and that if she does that, her mother will be happier, and that if he won't come back, she's hoping he'll ask her to come with him, and she would do that because she just doesn't want to stay here. And this is, again, I'm not sure if this is true at all, but she winds up following Amando into the woods, and it says, old Mother Sibley saw Amando leave along the Relum Trail. She told him the forest was a haunted place, but he just laughed and said everywhere had its ghosts. And this is the part where I started to be like, is this true? Nona fell into her own story as she had before, not hearing the words as she spoke them, only seeing events play out before the eye of her mind. So this is part of what made me go, okay, she fell into her story as she had before. Sounds like this isn't true, but again, part of it might be. So she starts running, and eventually she realizes that she is not going to catch up with him, that he's got like way too big a head start on her. And it says, everywhere has its ghost, Armando had said, but in most places those ghosts are at least hidden in the corners or tucked away at right angles to the world, waiting their moment. In the Relum forest you could see the ghosts, patterned on the gloom beneath the canopy, the distortion of their faces frozen into the bark of ancient trunks, and you could hear them too, screaming into the silence, not quite breaking it, but making it tremble. Wow, I love that line so much. Screaming into the silence and making it tremble. And she says that she was really scared, and it was like she was scared of what was in the woods, but she was also scared that she would never leave the village and she would stay and grow old there and waste all the years of her life as an outsider inside. So she crouches against a tree and waits. And it says, when you're moving in a dark and haunted forest, the urge is for every step to be taken more quickly than the last. There's a pressure between your shoulder blades. Each creak and groan is a hunter stalking you. Each flutter of wind, its breath close against your neck. You want to break and run in any direction so long as it's fast. When you're still, the urge is to be stiller. The knowledge that eyes are turned your way quietens the air inside your lungs. You make yourself small, hold every muscle tight, listen. And this continues on until she says, and then the moon's focus found me. And I had no idea what this meant. The moon focus found her, and then all of a sudden, there was red light, and the steam was like boiling through the clouds, and leaves are starting to icy rain became a warm fog. And I'm like reading this. I have no idea about the focus moon at this point. And I'm just like, what the fuck is she talking about? This was the part that I started to be like, did this girl go into a fugue state and just start to hallucinate? And this whole thing is some weird invention of her fevered brain? What the fuck? But then we find out later that the moon is actually basically this orbiting, kind of convex directive, what's the word I want? It's like a huge reflective shield, sort of, that focuses sunlight and warms the planet enough that the ice does not just continue to grow unabated. It gets melted down again. And so it's enough to sort of hold things in a stasis where the ice isn't receding, but it isn't able to build the way that it had been, which is pretty wild and a really intense piece of technology that I am extremely curious to know more about. Who invented it, how they got this up there, just and how do they direct the light, how exactly does this work? But we find that all out later. So she runs into a couple of dudes, and one of them is it turns out, as she says later, that Armando stole a bunch of gold from the bakers before he left town. So these guys are out here also looking for him. And he says that if we make her scream, Armando will come closer to try and save her. Now, this is what really, more than anything, made me doubt this story. Armando does not seem like somebody who actually gave a shit about her. So the idea that he would be willing to risk his neck on her behalf does not ring true to me. It seems a lot more like wishful thinking. But regardless, this dude tries to twist her arms behind her neck, and all of a sudden, the dude who had been twisting her arm behind her puts his hand to his throat, and there's all of this blood leaking through his fingers. And the other guy stops and tries to be like, he's here. And all of a sudden, the handle of a knife appears under his chin. And she hears somebody yell, "Run, Nona," and assumes that it's Armando, and keeps trying to say that Armando is the one that is stabbing all of these people. Is it, or is this her stabbing all of them and doing this all so quickly that these, like, she isn't even aware that she is doing this? Is there some sort of like alter ego or other state that comes over her in which she manages to defend herself and has no memory of it at all? Or does remember it and shies away from it because it's fucking scary? You know, I mean, she's what's supposed to be in this, like 9 years old? She's like really small. And being able to wreak this kind of violence and not be aware that you're capable of this and it just comes out, I can understand shying away from the reality of this. Like, yeah, that makes sense to me. So yeah, she hears him shout, supposedly. I saw a dark shape moving among the trees, a scream, a wet thunk, branches snapping. And then she says, like, and then the rest of it is true. They called me a witch and a thief and gave me to the child taker. And Clara's like, only your mother wasn't dead. She let them do it. And they're all just like, yeah, that sounds right. Because these girls all know how the world can be. And Jula says, how did Amando throw his daggers? You said the mist. And Nona, like, interrupts her and just is like, I'm going to sleep now. And I'm like, yeah, I bet you are. You know, this shit doesn't really add up. But it's kind of fun, you know? She's doing a little bit of a Joker thing where it's just like, here, I'm going to tell everybody a different story. Who knows? So she gets woken up by the focus moon again and hears somebody saying her name. And she winds up going out there, and it turns out that Hessa, the girl who is disabled and who had been part of her group that got caught up before in the child taker's carriage, is out there waiting for her and says something like, you came. So I guess Hessa is somehow able to, like, project into Nona's mind or get her to hear, like, because she keeps looking around and hearing Nona. But it feels like once she gets outside, Hessa is too far away to have just been saying Nona and for her to have heard it all the way inside. But, you know, and she also, like, follows, it seems, for a moment the moon's light caught in bright lines upon the floor seemed to align into a single thread leading from the room. So, like, what? Can Hessa do this? Did she do that? Is that, like, what? So then we get the story from Hessa. And guys, I am not going to lie. Once I knew what was going to happen, I low-key skimmed. Because, like so many people, having animal cruelty in your story, it gets to me real bad. And I know that's the point. I get it. That's fine. But I don't mean it gets to me like, oh, it makes me really sad. I mean, it gets to me in that it makes me feel sick to my stomach and like I am going to curl up in a ball for an hour and a half and not talk. It is the kind of thing that fucks with me so deeply that I can't shake it for like a full day. And I couldn't do this to myself. So once I started to realize what was happening, I kind of like pushed quickly through this section. There was one time where I kept thinking it was going to be, I was reading I can't even remember which Stephen King novel it was because he fucking kills a dog in every damn book he writes. But there was a scene where this guy is like kicking a dog to death. And I really thought that it wasn't going to be as long as it was. So I was reading intending to just be like, you know, try and push through it and be strong with it and get through the scene. And it goes on so much longer than I thought. And I really was in like a bad state after. And so this one, I decided not to trust that it was going to be brief because the whole vibe of this priest is that I am not going to make this brief. He wants to break this kid. That's the whole fucking point. That's what he says in words. So I was like, okay, I can't just rely on the fact that this is going to be over quickly. So this poor kid, Hessa manages to tell this story by touching Nona, and Nona like goes into Hessa's memory and experiences this as if she is Hessa. And she gets to see firsthand how this all goes down. So Giljan is trying to sell Marcus and tells this guy that he's got like the blood that he's looking for, and apparently he can commune with animals in a way that other bloods can't. And the priest is like getting up in Marcus's face, and Forefoot, the mule, defends Marcus from the priest by biting him. And the priest, who is a complete piece of human filth and trash, decides that he's going to punish this dumb animal for a thing that it cannot help. And he ties this mule up, and ties it to a pillar, and he begins to beat this animal, which he takes as, you want me to pull this cart, because that's all he understands, because he's a fucking animal. And he can't move. He can't pull. So, Martin just said the high priest, the one who's now apparently coming to Sweet Mercy. Shit, Martin, I didn't even put it together that these were the same person. Oh, shit. Well, this dude is in the middle of beating this animal to death to try and, like, get Marcus to break. And Marcus throws himself down next to the animal and wraps his arms around him and takes some of the beating on his own body. And it says, inside in the core of her, she knew the moment that Marcus found the edge of his power. Whether it was a word whispered into Forefoot's ear or something that bled between them from hand to hide, Hessa couldn't tell. And Forefoot raises its head and pulls. And the whole like pile of stone and the pillar jolts forward, and the fucking roof caves in. It says the priest went down beneath them. A heartbeat later, the rope snapped and Forefoot collapsed. Marcus followed him down. The mule took one more shuddering breath and died. So I'm assuming Marcus is dead. I had assumed from that story that the priest was dead. But if he's now coming to Sweet Mercy, I guess not, which is a fucking shame. I really thought that he was the one who had died. Ugh, that sucks. So this is a fucking intense ability that Hessa has, and I would love to know how common this sort of shit is, that she can just do this and be like, yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, let's see, and treat it so casually, because it feels like this has to be a common thing. Not necessarily common, but like not unheard of, right? But damn, that is a fucked up tale, and I hate this guy, and I really wish that he was dead, and I'm super sad. So thanks for ruining that, Martin. Bummer. But I hate this. I hate it. So I am running out of time. I've only got like 7 minutes left, but I'm going to talk really quickly about Jula, who is like kind of getting friendly with Arabella, and Clara clearly has some feelings about that. And it's just kind of like, what the fuck? You're her friend now? To which Jula's like, look, she's rich. She can't help that she's rich. She's really not that bad. It's fine. And they're talking about the prophecy. And it basically boils down to that a holy witch called Sister Argatha made the prophecy. And it says the ark will open when the 4 tribes demand it with one voice. And everybody always assumed that that meant get one of each blood to say this thing at the same time and it'll open. But that has not worked. So now people think that it means one person with all 4 bloods in them. And there's a lot of like theorizing that nobody really buys this prophecy, but it's just being done to sort of like distract people when shit starts to get really bad. And I appreciate that. Like, that feels like a real thing that would definitely happen. And at one point they're talking about a touch doesn't count, a touch of the blood. You could have a touch of all 4 and nobody would get excited. Sister Kettle's a Hunska Prime with a touch of Marjal, and nobody's calling her the Argatha's chosen one. She is? Nona asked. How do you know? Kettle can shadow weave. It's the easiest martial trick, and even touches can do it near the ship heart. Okay, guys, what the fuck? I don't know what any of that means. Am I supposed to know what that means? Shadow weave, even touches can do it near the ship heart. Again, the ship heart and shadow weaving is not a thing, and nobody explains this. And I'm not clear on, is this like is this book like part of a series that has already been written that this would have been understood by a reader who is familiar with this world already? Or am I not supposed to understand this part? I'm not sure. So I tried to like really pay close attention, but nobody nobody explains any of this or gives me any more hints about it. So yeah, basically they're just talking about this prophecy again and who it could be. And I think that most of us as readers are just assuming that it's Nona and that she's like kind of hiding herself. But we shall see. So they go into, Mistress Academia's class. And this is where we find out about what the moon actually is and how this works. And we have Nona taking her class to learn how to write. And we also have the poisoning, which is just so great. I love this so much. The class is called Shade. And when it turns out that it's Sister Apple, I just love that so much. It's just such a surprise. What a pure little like soul to be doing this terrible thing. It's really funny to me. Mistress Shade, the poisoner, turned around with a warm smile for the class. So she has been warned, Nona has, that apparently it's a tradition that on the first day, Mistress Shade begins by poisoning the new students. And Nona falls right into the trap that I saw coming myself. And I was just like, Nona, come on. She doesn't take the candy that she is offered, assuming that this is going to be a really obvious, but she's still on her guard as she heads back to her seat. And Arabella sits down and kind of shifts around and has a look on her face like, ow, what the fuck was that? Not a huge production, but there's definitely something noticeable. So when Nona comes to sit down, she checks and there's a pin with something smeared on the end of it on her seat that was put there while she was up at the front of the class. So she thinks that she's really figured this out and knocks that pin off and sits down, to which Mistress Shade is like, well done. I will not try to poison you again. You passed the test. And as soon as she's like, I will not try to trick you again, I'm like, bitch, all right, what are you doing? What's about to happen? Sure enough, Sister Kettle comes in and is like, I've just got the stuff for Nona for her writing supplies. And this is when I'm like, oh yeah, okay. She's definitely going to deliver this in the middle of a totally unrelated class. This isn't shady at all, which is pun intended. And Nona does not think about this at all. She's very distracted by the beauty of the slate that has been put down in front of her. Now, listen, I am obsessed with stationery. So as much as I am annoyed with Nona for not figuring out exactly what this was the moment that it started to happen, there is also a part of me that understands deeply getting so wrapped up in this beautiful, new fresh notebook and pens that you just got handed that all of your common sense flies right out the window. So I am not that mad at her. I was just a little bit like, oh, no, come on. But I get it, and when she puts it down after picking up the slate and taking a look at it, she notices that there is something on her fingers. And it turns out that this is something that leads her to losing control of her muscles. And she's getting sort of the opposite of the effects that Arabella has. Arabella goes totally stiff and locked up. But Nona's causes her to go totally limp and fall against the table. And Sister Apple says, do you know what the most insidious poison is? Trust. Trust sidesteps all of your precautions. So give your trust sparingly, or better still, not at all. And novice Clara, you will be grinding stink corns in the fume cavern for an hour after the lesson finishes. I love that she throws that out there because Clara is behind her rolling her eyes, and somehow she fucking knows that. I would love to find out exactly how she knows. So yeah, Nona winds up like recovering by the end of the day, but it is still pretty intense, you know? So yeah, then she has her class with Sister Kettle, whom, you know, there has been some slander about that I'm very curious on. And she talks about the different sisters a little bit, and Sister Pan, and it says, Nona found it easier to picture Sister Pan working magic than Sister Kettle's chat and humor replaced by quantal serenity. And I don't know if Sister Pan can touch the path anymore. She was old when the abbess was a novice. But what I can tell you is that she was once one of the great holy witches. And she followed the path that runs through all things. High priests came to see her. Emperor Extal, the third of his name. And when the Dernish sailed against us more than 50 years ago, so many of them in their sick wood barges that they almost made a bridge across the corridor, it was Sister Pan and Sister Rain of Garen's Crag that met their storm weavers and swept them from the sea. So don't bury the old girl yet. And don't call her old girl or tell her that I told you this story. So yeah, I am very curious about meeting some more of these other women, and I delight in the fact that Kettle is willing to gossip and tell her some of these things. And there is a moment when Clara went to see her father at the prison, and she has a penny that she plays with all the time. And she's constantly talking about how money is freedom and how money will get her what she wants in the end. Because you can't really trust anything else. You can't trust luck. You can't trust kindness of strangers. You have to be able to pay for things. And when she comes back from this visit, the coin that she has is silver. And Clara says, I made one become many. I had some luck. She smiled, but she looked sad. And I'm just like, all right, bitch, what are you doing? Like, there could be any number of things that she's doing while she's supposedly visiting her father in prison. Is she turning tricks? Which, you know, she's like fucking 9 years old, 10 years old. Like, that's horrifying, but totally possible. Is she hurting people? Is she like not actually going to the prison at all, but doing something else and not telling anybody? But if she was, why would she look sad about it? Is she being paid by somebody that like wants her father to be in prison to like bear false witness against him or something? Like, I keep coming up with worst case scenarios because she looks sad as a result, even though money is what she wants and that's what she got. So like, I don't know, you know, but I'm very curious. And like, Nona tries to ask her precisely what she did, and they just get interrupted by the other girls, Jula and Ketty and Ruli coming in. And Clara gets up and starts like joking around and smiling with them. And Nona never really gets to ask her question, to which I'm like, that's probably good, Nona. Like, low key, maybe don't want to know what the answer is, you know? But we'll see. Clara seems tough, man. You know, the kind of tough that could get cruel if it doesn't get tempered with something. We'll see. So that's the end of these chapters. Thank you all again so much for listening. I appreciate you, Martin, very much for commissioning this. This book is really good. It's heartbreaking and I hate you, but also thank you. And I hope that you guys are all enjoying listening. Please let me know. If you're interested in commissioning any episodes, you can go to unspoiledpodcast.com/shop and purchase an episode and keep me going on this. And there's also a link when you do that to take a look at the spreadsheet of who is commissioning what and when those episodes are, so you can see how much of Red Sister there is left to go. I'm not sure. I think Martin has several other episodes commissioned after this. I'm not sure if that completes the book or not. So you can go and check on that. But every episode I cover about 50 pages roughly. So, all right, everybody. Thank you again so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you soon with a new episode. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
an Unspoiled Network podcast. That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.